My interest is in the human mind and how to develop it fully. So I'm going to be looking at questions of outside, using the brain, but in the more generic questions. And one of the topics that I'm interested in is developing our minds fully. And by the end of this talk, which will be about 30 to 35 minutes, I hope I'll give you a wider idea of our minds, of our possibilities, and how we can go about developing them. If you understand this slide, you probably understand the whole talk. This will be our beginning position. We'll start from here. We'll take a look at some developments in the area of psychedelics and different ways they're developing, particularly that have to do with cognition, some that have to do with spirituality, touch on healing here and there, and on creative problem solving. And this will take us, we'll start with sort of a narrow view and widen it to look at wider questions, and widen that to look at wider ones, and finally much wider ones about expanding what it means or what it might mean in the future to have a fully developed human mind. So then at the end of the show, we'll come back and we'll see this slide again, but I think from a more informed and I hope better view. This will put us in context. Looking at the area of psychedelics, it falls into a number of areas that greatly overlap, but basically have different approaches to it. The one on the bottom is the one we're looking at right now, the sort of popular culture. As you know, there are lots of websites, there are movies that are coming along all the time, publications, conferences, and lectures like this one. So we're basically in this popular culture one. I divide it into 5 major areas. Medicine is the best known, and Nick mentioned some of those and the research that's being done for various neuroses and psychoses, for PTSD, and so forth. So these areas are being developed, and it's important when you hear this and you tell other people about it that we're not talking about going to a doctor and getting a prescription and going to CVS and coming home with some LSD to take on Saturday afternoon. That is not the way the research is done. And the research that has been done in the past came up with a much better technique. And as Nick mentioned, people are screened, and if they're going for neurosis and psychosis, of course, they are eligible. If they're neurosis or psychosis and they're going for the other research problem, then they're screened out. They're prepared usually with about 12 hours of meeting with 2 guides, a male and a female, to prepare them, to let them know what they might experience. And so if something unusual experience comes along, they have an idea that, oh, this is such and such. And then the 2 guides stay with them during the session and are there to monitor the session. The current technique is to have the volunteer. I like to use the word volunteer at Johns Hopkins. They're not patients, they're not subjects, they're volunteers. Have a nice living room type setting, and they do the same thing at the other locations. A nice couch to lie down on, eye shades, and listen to music through earphones. The purpose of that is so they don't get distracted with, well, watch the walls move and so forth, and they'll direct their attention inward. So that's the purpose of doing that, and to have the person experience his own mind or her own mind more fully. Religion is the second most popular area in terms of the research that's been done. Not much has been done. This is a very exciting area. Actually, next Saturday, Bruce and I are going to be speaking at Wheaton at the Theosophical Society, and we'll touch on some of the spiritual research that's been done. There's a lot written on that. The arts, you saw a little bit of the artwork that's been done. Music, of course, is the field that everybody knows about in psychedelics. And there are more arts coming along. And the 2 I'm interested in are the intellectual and general public. How do we interest the people in the intellectual community in psychedelics? Well, to interest people in the therapeutic community, present some medicines and therapy. For arts, you sort of install ideas and sensitivity to whatever medium they're working in. And to interest intellectuals, you provide them with ideas. So this is largely going to be talking about ideas that stimulate thought and help the thought process along. And the general public, toward the end, I'll have about 4 or 5 slides that'll talk about ways of introducing the general public. And if any of you are associated with Calamos or PowerShares or Nuveen, this is particularly aimed at you and the people you know. So let's take a look here. We'll start with this idea of Concilience. This is the idea that it should be possible to put together research for lots of different fields and to build an overall scaffolding of ideas so it's clear how they all relate to each other as one sort of long building of ideas. And down at the bottom, of course, we have subatomic physics, which become more complicated and moves us up to chemistry, then to biology and psychology and the social sciences and the humanities. So this linking together is a natural for psychedelics, because a way to do this research, there are other ways, is to have, your independent variable at one area and the dependent variable at the other, and you've linked these two areas. And what I'll be talking about a lot is, of course, chemistry or biochemistry, the psychoactive drugs that are part of psychedelics, and how they affect, and we'll look at psychology, social sciences, and even some leads on the humanities. So this is a way of approaching this idea of Concilience. Edward O. Wilson, who's one of the best-known biologists, has written several books, gotten prizes for his books. He's the ant man. He's the guy who, if you read about ants, you're probably reading about Wilson. A fascinating guy, but his interest is a lot more than these little crawly things. And he wrote a book called Concilience and calls this idea Concilience. So here's this idea: if you give a drug down at the lower level, what are the outcomes up at the upper level? Also, you can do it the other way around. You could arrange your volunteers by social class or education or gender or any other demographic variable and give them the drugs and see what differences those make in their experiences. So it's a way of going both ways on this. So Concilience is one of the big league intellectual games, and this is a way to make that game richer, and now you can actually do intentional research on Concilience by using psychoactive drugs and other psychoactive processes too. We'll talk more about that in a couple slides. So this is an interesting example of using the drug approach to Concilience. In his book Concilience, Wilson mentions that in South America and the Amazon, they use a psychoactive drug. We would call it ayahuasca, and that it affects the way that people think about things socially and spiritually. So there's a cognitive psychologist from Hebrew University in Jerusalem who went on sabbatical to Brazil and heard about this substance called ayahuasca. I thought he'd try it, and his name is Benny Shannon. As a cognitive psychologist, he was very interested in what's going on in his own thinking processes and the thinking processes of other people. And so he stayed there and had stayed there a couple years, had quite a few ayahuasca experiences himself, interviewed Brazilians, North Americans, and Europeans who came down to try to look how their thinking processes varied with ayahuasca. So this opens up a whole new field of looking at cognitive processes in different mind-body states. And we'll talk a lot about this. Now, what he found out was that he came up with 11 characteristics of thinking that are not generally considered in cognitive psychology. And these are 3 of them. I won't go into the whole list of them. Let me say, once in a while, I'm going to call what I call gist slides. A gist slide is a slide that has lots of words on them. I don't expect you to know or read them all, but I want you to get an overall impression. So this is a gist slide. This has 3 of the changes that Shannon discovered with ayahuasca. Now, what he did basically is undermine the current paradigm, the current assumptions of cognitive psychology. And what he discovered when he did this basically is he built a new paradigm for cognitive psychology, one that looked at thinking from an ayahuasca perspective and backwards looked at ayahuasca from a cognitive psychology perspective. And I think this sets the model for lots of future directions. And I would say his book Antipodes of the Mind, is the book that characterizes how to approach this field. If I were teaching a graduate course in practically any field and I wanted to enter my graduate students in this whole new direction of research, I'd had them read Benny Shannon's book. It's a very readable type book because he demonstrates crossing two disciplines, well, in this case, cognitive psychology and ayahuasca, and any other discipline in ayahuasca, or other ways of changing the human mind. Now, the big thing behind this is to recognize that almost all research that's done is research in using our ordinary mind. I call it our default state of consciousness, our default mind-body state. But the mind is a variable. So what happens when we redo all this research that we've done and use the mind as a variable? We'll get into this idea in a bit more. So he may have invented a technique for experimentally developing new paradigms. Okay, now we're going to talk about problem solving. The first one up there, we're going to talk about improving current skills and processes. This is what everybody writes about. Something like 30% of college students have used either Adderall or some other drug that is used psychologically as an approach to improve their own cognitive processes. That's what people are writing about. But this is only one approach to expanding cognitive processes psychedelically. There are also new ideas and new questions that are raised. And the one that I just gave you of giving a drug to somebody and seeing how that affects the higher levels on the scaffolding is a new research process that can be done. And there are new questions and new experiments that come along. Finally, inventing new skills and processes. That star is up there because we're going to get to that at the end of the talk, and this will just sort of alert us that this idea is coming up. So I want to give 3 examples of problem solving that psychedelics have contributed to. The first is a Nobel Prize on the PCR technique. A problem with biology and medicine was that often samples were too small to analyze. If you watch the research shows on TV that show somebody like finding one cell of a possible suspect and they don't know who it is, they'll give it to a lab and they'll actually sort of develop more cells out of it. That's the PCR technique. And so Kary Mullis solved the small sample problem in biology, in medicine, and in forensics by inventing the PCR technique. Basically, you take the little sample you have and you sort of grow more sample so you can analyze it. And he got a Nobel Prize for this. The reason psychedelics fit into this is that he was interviewed and asked how he came up with the idea. And he said that in doing psychedelics, he learned to visualize. And he took that cognitive skill and could imagine himself inside a cell, watching the processes work, and then realize he could do those processes, turn them into a technology. And so this is a case of learning a cognitive skill in one state, a psychedelic state, and transferring it back. The transfer problem is itself a problem. You know, lots of times you wake up and you know you had a dream at night and you can't remember the dream, and then suddenly sometime, with me it's about 10:30, it like downloads and you can remember the dream. Well, that's a transfer problem. So can we transfer information from one mind-body state to another mind-body state? You notice I use the mind-body. I don't use the word state of consciousness. The word consciousness has 6 or 8 very different meanings, and people think they're talking about the same thing when they use the word consciousness, but they're using that word in a lot of different ways. We can go into that if you want to go into that in the question area, but I use mind-body state, and an example would be being awake, sleeping, or dreaming, or anything else that sort of causes a shift in mind and body, and it's considered one thing. I don't use the hyphen. Okay, mind-body state. So a second is finding shelf space. At the beginning of the computer revolution, there were lots and lots of people who developed languages, and they all wanted everybody else to use their language and sell their language. And so in business, there's something called shelf space. That's how do you get your product on the shelf? Go to the cereal aisle and you just, cereal after cereal after cereal. If you come up with a new cereal, how would you get them to stock your cereal? Well, this is the question that everybody had. And people were trying to sell it to everybody else in the field. And one guy said, let's give it away. All right, and then we'll ask people to donate the money back to the company. And that if we're lucky, enough people will use it because it's free, and a not good percentage will send the money back to the company and we'll make money. And they started to make money. But because it was free and because so many people used it, it became the standard. This is micrograms from Microsoft. This is how Microsoft got the field. And the guy who came up with that technique called shareware was Bob Wallace. He was either the 7th or the 13th person in the Microsoft business. And at that time, they could pay the employees enough to get gas for their car, pay their room and board, and find something to eat. But they couldn't pay them any other way, so they just gave them lots and lots and lots of shares. Imagine being number 17 or 7 and getting Microsoft shares. So Bob retired after a while, and actually for a long time was like Mr. Psychedelic book guy. He has died, nothing to do with psychedelics in the meantime. Professional problem solving. At Stanford Research Institute, Willis Harman and James Fadiman and some other people collected professionals from a number of different fields who had intractable problems. They've been working on them, thinking about them, researching them, reading about them. In other words, they'd done all the preparation work but still were unable to solve the problem. They brought them together in groups of 4 and gave them a moderate dose of LSD. They would then listen to music for several hours as a group, come together for lunch, nice fresh fruits and nuts and things that taste particularly good when you're tripping, and then separate and work on their problems individually. At lunch, they would discuss them a little bit with the other people in the group. And during the musical session, they would sort of like run this stuff through their mind. Then after lunch, work separately and come up with their solutions. And there were 27 professionals in this: intellectuals, artists, designers, people in physics, people who have been really working in their field, and they actually came up with 44 solutions because some people sort of solved a problem rather quickly and then did it with another problem. And Jim Fadiman's book is clearly the best thing to read on this. It's a guide to Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Yes, I really recommend it. And psychotherapy is the one that everybody knows about, and we've heard about that. Now, the thing here is that what we're seeing is that one of the definitions of intelligence, there are a whole bunch of different ones, is solving problems or producing goods of values in a society. Now, those are 4 examples of producing goods or services of value in a society using psychedelics. So that qualifies as psychedelics boosting intelligence in those cases. And in a little bit, we'll talk about the possibility of, does intelligence vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? Those 4 instances are examples that it can in psychedelics. But this is not an example of, if I took a psychedelic and had an insight into theoretical physics, I would have no idea what I had. It's got to be with a field that you know what an insight is and can recognize it. Sternberg, mental self-management, we'll talk about a little bit later. That's why the star is there. It's another handy definition of intelligence. So, this allows us to ask this question: how does problem solving vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? That's a rather logical question to ask about that. And then you get to thinking, well, Benny Shannon asked, how does cognition vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? This is based on a study done at Johns Hopkins. They've published 4 different articles on 3 different studies. They found that when they produce a mystical experience, and we'll be talking more about that in the last session, when mystical experience is the variable, a number of things happen in the way people see and interpret and live their lives. of the group that they used, and this is a specially selected group. Okay, this is not generalizable to the general population. Of the people who had mystical experiences, there's a standard scale called the M scale or the mysticism scale. It's been around for a long time, been validated and replicated lots of times. 11% said it was the single most important, meaningful experience in their lives, and another 58% said it was one of the top 5. So here we have an experimental study of meaningfulness. So meaningfulness is not just something for philosophers to talk about and blah, 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 but you can actually do experiments in which meaningfulness is a dependent variable. A similar thing applies to spiritual experience. 33% of those who had mystical experiences, which was most of the people, said it was the most meaningful, most spiritually significant experience of their life. And 67%, including the 33% now, okay, said it was one of the 5 most spiritual significant experiences in their life. So here we're opening up the door to experimental religious studies. I'd like to see, divinity schools, seminaries, religious studies departments, and other sort of educational religious groups recognizing this as a direction to go. Altruism is an interesting one. There's something called the Persisting Effects Questionnaire. It's hundreds of items long, and within that are 8 items that are called the altruism scale, which basically ask, how willing are you to help other people? And the scale is a Likert scale. That is the way it goes all the way from not at all the way I feel to very much identical to what I feel, and spots in between. Now, if everybody answered the most extreme in every one of those, you'd get 100. That's where the 100 comes from. Now, the Ritalin, they had a control group that took Ritalin. Of course, the people didn't know and the guides didn't know. It was blind all the way around. 19% was the average score of the people who took Ritalin, and 44.5% of people who had a mystical experience. So now we have open experimentation in social relations. And open-mindedness, the average age of the people in the group was 45. It's unusual for the major personality traits to change after the mid-60s, there's an interesting slip, after the mid-20s. Okay, so this group basically was in the mid-40s. And there's a standard personality inventory of 5 items. One of them was openness, and they found that 60% increased their openness scores. By the way, these are 2 sets of measurements, one done immediately after the event, another done a year, basically 14 months later. And these are the 14-month scores. Also, there's a certain amount of possible distortion of people looking at their own experience, so they also interviewed friends and family of the volunteers in the study, and they get the same results on this. So what we have here now is a philosophical concept, meaningfulness, a religious concept, spiritual significance, social relations, and a personality variable. Now these are also open now to experimentation. Just look at the stuff that's possible now to research is just incredibly expanded. And this is a gist slide, okay? There's our question up at the top. How does or do blank vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? And we've looked at problem solving, meaningfulness, openness, altruism, values, and spiritual significance. And there are all those others. And the big one is the little et cetera down in the corner. So think whatever you're interested in and plug it into this question. And we've just invented a research agenda because all this is now available. You can basically look at practically anything people do and ask, how does it vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? This is a diagram from a book that looks at a number of academic disciplines and areas of study that are influenced by LSD. Again, this is a gist slide. There are a lot of them up there. So these are all the ones that they've identified. This is from a book called The Pharmacology of LSD, a critical review that came out 3 years ago from Oxford University Press. If you have a good biological and biochemical background, you can read the book and make sense out of it. I don't and I can't. But you can look up a few things. But if you have a good biochemical background, this is the place to look for the research as of a couple years ago. Now, remember we just saw this slide. And there's a box for philosophy, religion, social relationships, and open-mindedness. Now, these are humanities issues. So what we're doing now is opening up experimental humanities. And I've added some ovals there, the ones that I think they missed on the pharmacology book. Film and film criticism, lit criticism. Whenever a psychology comes along, it can be used in psychocriticism, that is using psychological ideas to understand literature, film, and so forth. I've done one on Snow White. Huxley's novel Island takes place it's a fiction story, but there's a drug in there called moksha that he writes about. And next semester, after my class is over, I'm going to be doing an interpretation of Pink Floyd, The Wall. That's that other one up there. Rhetoric and Languages, another humanities topic. Stan Grof, who is the major psychotherapist in the area, has published an article on perinatal roots of wars, revolution, and totalitarianism. By perinatal, he means having to do with birth, not prenatal, perinatal. And what he found was that in his work and the work of other people, he looked at the language that political leaders use when they're trying to get their people to go to war. And what they use is birth language. And the guy who did the research, his name is Lloyd DeMose, started with Alexander the Great and went through Hitler and found the speeches of how you get people to go to war, and found the birth language is the imagery that's used in this. And because we're not very sophisticated in this, we will see this. Well, you'll hear our politicians use this, probably not intentionally, but at least using it. In philosophy, okay, we talked about one philosophical issue. Tom Riedlinger, former resident of Brookfield, wrote a paper in which he traces Jean-Paul Sartre's mescaline experience to his existential philosophy. And again, using Groff's view of the human mind as the words to use to discover it. Mythology, Joseph Campbell, Mr. Myth and Symbol, was a very close friend of Stanislav Grof. In fact, Groff's wife, Christina, was one of Joe's students at Sarah Lawrence. And he writes in Myths to Live By that he had just received a manuscript version of what became Groff's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And he found that Groff's digging into the human mind using psychedelics as a sort of a vehicle for going into the mind came out with a view of the human mind that is almost identical with what Campbell comes up with by studying the world's myths and legends. So we've got corroboration coming from two very different views on the human mind. The next one, The Apples of Apollo, is written by Carl Ruck and two other authors. Ruck is a professor of classics at Boston University with a specialty in the botany of the ancient Near East. And in this, he interprets and reinterprets many of the myths of ancient Greece, Anatolia, and the rest of the Near East as looking for magic mushrooms. And it's a particularly rich book. If you get it, I really recommend reading the footnotes. Some footnotes are just deadly, but he has these little gems tucked around in all these footnotes. And there's a wonderful chapter called Jason, the Drug Man, and he claims the story of Jason looking for the golden fleece, that the golden fleece, remember he sailed up into the Black Sea, went to the eastern edge of the Black Sea, were dried Amanita muscaria caps coming down from Siberia, and the shamanic use in Siberia was the first recorded in Western literature. And when they're dried up, they look like little pieces of leather. And he also has a wonderful chapter called Jesus the Drug Man. And if you want to have fun or get your friends in Christianity very angry, just suggest that Jesus was basically a drug dealer. Finally, Hillman, so I love this story. He was a botany major at the University of Wisconsin, and he switched to classics. I'm very curious about why. And he wrote a dissertation on the ancient Greece and ancient Rome using psychoactive drugs. His dissertation advisor was incensed. Not the rational people of ancient Greece and Rome. They would never do such a thing, and made him drop that chapter out of his dissertation in order to get it published. Well, this is his response. He wrote a whole book on it, elaborating on that chapter. So if you're interested in ancient Greece and history, so we've got psychocriticism, rhetoric, philosophy, mythology, and history and classics. The hearts of the humanities are now open for reinterpretation and even experimental work. Okay, we're going to step back and take a much bigger picture now. That little brown area down around 5 o'clock, okay, represents psychoactive drugs. And of course, psychedelics are just one slice of the whole psychoactive drug field. There are all these medical psychoactive drugs that are out there. And so psychedelics are just part of this slice. So we're looking at a slice of a slice when we're talking about psychedelics. And yet there are all these other ways of producing different mind-body states. I call them families of mind-body states, because each one isn't just one item. There are lots of types of psychoactive drugs. There are lots of types of meditation, types of prayer, yoga, sensory overload and sensory isolation, and so forth. So every slice of this pie has lots of little slices in it. And remember that question we asked of how does blank vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? That gets re-asked not just for each big slice, but for every little slice. See, the size of the opening here intellectually is just enormous. That's why I say, that there's a lot of appeal to people whose basic work is inventing, refining, and using concepts, that is, the intellectual professions. Okay, now in my field, I'm an educational psychologist. There are 3 basic questions. One is, what is the nature of the human mind? What's its greatest fulfillment? And how do we achieve it? So what we're looking at now is a huge, an enormously large view of the human mind, because we can use our minds in all these mind-body states, some for good purposes and some not for good purposes. And we can ask all those questions for every one of these. Now, to develop the human mind fully, basically we have the education of our own default ordinary mind-body state. But there are all these other states. And so our education system, like here and at Northern and everywhere else, is basically the education of our ordinary mind-body state. Well, what about all these other mind-body states that all these other psychotechnologies produce, and all the other abilities that may reside in them? And the question came up earlier about curing in different mind-body states. So let's ask this question. How does curing vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? And let's look at this question of when you're healthy, or when you're feeling happy, and your work is going well, and your relationships are going well, you're likely to be healthier, and the very opposite. I mean, everybody knows that stress produces illness. So what about an experience that not only makes people generally happy, but probably exceptionally happy, ecstatically happy, happier than they've ever thought they can be? That's one of those mind traits that comes out of mystical experiences. So will mystical experiences turn out to be extremely healthy? Maybe. Now here's another way to look at the question. During medical research, or psychological research too, the placebo is always given. And a placebo, is chosen because it should have no effect, and you want to compare the placebo effect with the treatment effect. And about a third of the people will get better with a placebo. And it's not always just saying they feel better, but they actually do get better. Now, a placebo is chosen because it has no effect. If there is an effect, it's called the placebo effect. There's a logic problem there, to attribute an effect to something that is chosen because it has no effect, right? So I propose that instead of that, we say, how does placeboing vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? That is, using the word placeboing as a verb, or gerund in that case. Okay, so is it possible that, and if you look at the research on spontaneous remission, there is a research area out there called spontaneous remission. It often has to do with shift in mind-body states. And the anecdotes are all full of this too. So maybe we're onto something of using psychedelics to produce mystical experiences, which are the strongest positive affect a person can have, and that may boost the immune system. Now, the reasons to think that there may be a limit on that too, I don't want to go into all the details, but this is one of the areas that really deserves, I think there's a Nobel Prize in that for somebody. Just an incredible thing. What happens if mystical experiences boost the immune system and if you can use psychedelics to produce mystical experiences? Wow, that would really open up all kinds of possibilities. Okay, now why isn't this being picked up by society? I think there are two big reasons, and lack of widespread public knowledge, and this is an attempt to overcome that, and lack of funding for research and development. And this is the little side excursion that I have on how to interest the general public in psychedelics. This is the way the research is funded now. In the middle, we see a guy standing there saying, spare change. And these are various groups, nonprofit groups, non-governmental groups that are doing research in this area. But basically what they're doing is going to benefactors or patrons and asking for donations, plus groups like MAPS have lots of members, each contributing a little bit of money. But it costs at least $120 million to get a new drug approved, and usually much more than that. So how are we going to get psychedelics approved for an enormous number of indications and conditions? Well, clearly, there are only so many millionaires and billionaires who are able to fund it. So I've come up with a solution what I think solves both the public knowledge problem and the fundraising problem. Remember histograms when we were studying statistics? This is my histogram of the number of people who are interested in money versus the number of people who are interested in unitive consciousness. Unitive consciousness should probably be smaller, but I wanted to make it visible. So if we're going to appeal to the public in general, we need to appeal on a money basis. To appeal to intellectuals, we present ideas. To appeal to the public, we present money-making ideas. So this is my idea for money-making. A company who has two divisions, and they provide sessions. So the research is being done now, basically has developed a technique for dividing sessions. And there'd be a therapy session and a professional development session. And they would be probably, well, for example, a consortium of universities could have one. Businesses could have them and use them as do the problem-solving aspect of it. Religious organizations and large churches could have them and use them for religious and spiritual development. So here's another gist slide. This lists some of the topics in which there is good basic research, but more research is needed for every one of these. And these would be the treatments that the therapy division would be. For example, how much would it be worth to somebody be cured of alcoholism? I mean, just plain dollars worth, okay. Or PTSD, that is probably the biggest, the quickest opening. Also, the one I call hospice care, that's treating death anxiety, not because of the underlying disease, but because of the anxiety of facing death, and that's probably the second. Those would be the two first ones that have happened. But every one of these then could have sessions. And you would have people who are professionally trained to do this, because you just can't take any old doctor and say, okay, you know, give psychedelics to your patient. It's just not going to work. So people have to be trained, and they have to know how to prepare people, how to sit with them during the session, how to handle problems when they come up, and so forth. So this requires a medical therapeutic practice. And with the professional development brand, you would have to have people who would be working there. Okay, you're all used to watching TV and having an ad, so this is my ad. I've talked about these topics in this book. The second division, of course, would be the personal or professional growth division, and would include, you know, problem solving, aesthetic stuff, music, all the stuff that's up here, and be a way to explore parts of the human mind that have not been well explored before. Okay, this is the kicker. Okay, this is how to get word out to the general population. When you're investing yourself, or if you have a fiduciary responsibility for other people's money, you have to find out all the pertinent facts about an investment, and that's called due diligence. Now, to look at a company who would sell its stock to the public to have psychotherapy or personal growth divisions, okay, everybody would have to look at the due diligence. And the due diligence is, what's the research on psychedelics? Now, I notice I have that asterisk, the things we know. I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago in New York City, and it was a group that has met now for 7 years to study psychedelics. So the we is the people in Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village. But you're now the we people too, because you know some of this. So in other words, all the research that has been done then gets read by the people in the financial community. There are also people in the financial community who've done psychedelics, and they know that. Okay, so they would already be in there. But this is the way to get the word out. And an initial public offering of a stock would have lots of fun in the financial press. I know I used to write financial stuff, and it'd be great writing headlines, you know, crazy headlines. But that's the way you get the word out. And the main thing is people have to read the research. And this research that's coming out, like when Johns Hopkins and Bellevue and UCLA and so forth, is really top quality research published in top quality journals. Now, and how could we raise a lot of money? Remember that slide I showed with the guy with the handing spare change? And there are all these groups around the outside. I think it's possible to raise $100 million, not divided among them, but for every one of them. Now, that really sounds absurd, but look at the numbers. There's a report, substance abuse and mental health report that's done every year by a government agency, and they have come out with the number that approximately 23.7 million Americans have done psychedelics. There's 14 million who have done MDMA, you know, ecstasy, the rave drug, the sort of the non-official psychedelic that's called psychedelic. Now, I'm assuming there's some overlap, so let's cut off half the MDMA people and add them in to the LSD people, and we came up with 30.7 million people. How many of those people have had experiences with the LSD that would make them willing to invest a small amount in a company who would provide, first of all, the money would be used to do the research, get FDA approval, and then provide the service. This is the standard model in biology and medicine and pharmacology, so this is the way you do it. Well, would it be 1%? I think it would be a lot more, but I have a very selective group of people that I know. But let's say it's 1%, and they would put in the mid-range of an IRA. That's $5,000. Okay, so if we have 1%, we have 300,000 people. Actually, it would be 307,000 people. I've left off the 7. That's lunch money. That's $35 million. We'll just go to lunch on that. Okay, times 5,000 is $1.5 billion. What if it isn't 1%? What if it's 3%? Okay, and this doesn't include people outside the United States. In Japan and Europe, psychedelics are very well known. It also doesn't include ayahuasca, peyote, mescaline, and all the other DMT, all the other drugs. Also, this doesn't include the big pools of money. It doesn't include venture capitalists, business development corporations, mutual funds, insurance companies. Well, you know all those people out there who handle money. So this is a 1% of a relatively small pool of money. I think 1.5 billion is a very modest amount. And the advantage is you can pay for the research, and the idea of, if this is such a good idea, put your money where your mouth is. Okay, this is doing it. Okay, and I think that a business plan is needed. How much would it cost to take somebody through a therapeutic session? What would be your profit margin and so forth? All that has to be worked out, but this is the main idea. Here's our board of directors. Let me just say, see our chairman sitting up there. Okay. The guy next to him is Rick Doblin, formerly of Winnetka, and now the executive director of MAPS. And Nick and I are on the board of directors. And you're those people with the backs to us there. By the way, this was the caption for this cartoon from the New Yorker. I didn't make that up. This was in January 1977. Okay, there are a lot of cartoons about drugs out there, but this shows that that idea was around enough so that you could publish a cartoon about it. To have a cartoon about an idea, the idea has to be out in the culture. It's a way of measuring what the culture is aware of. So here we are in 1977. So now we're back on this slide with a slightly different position. Notice I says ingredients for cognitive invention. The original one was to make a full map of the human mind. Now each of these pieces of the pie, these families of psychotechnologies, and I said they each have lots of the little sort of slices in them, are out there. Now, let's take a look at how we might be able to use this in a different way. I use a three-model map of invention, insight, which is basically in science, doing the research, finding out the information. Implementation, that is, you use it some way. For example, there's a new decade of the brain that's been proposed, and the idea is that we'll do a lot of additional research on the brain, and we'll use it to solve problems like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, various brain diseases. But that's as far as it goes. But I look at the third stage, and if you look at invention, the third stage is the really exciting one, and that's that once you know this information, what else can you do with it? For example, when movies were first made, they put the camera in the middle of the 12th row and they shot a play, and that's what a movie was. I mean, look what's happened since then. So all these inventions that are coming along not only can be used to overcome problems and mental problems that we're talking about in psychedelics, but the question is, how can we use them in new ways to do new things with our minds? For example, that scaffolding tells us we're getting back to our home base now. We're approaching that's the skyline. In physics, there are synthetic elements. They're making them right here, the Fermilab. In chemistry, synthetic materials, things like plastics and all the stuff that really make our culture what they are. Synthetic biology is coming along. It's not just a matter of genetic changes, but actually using biological processes to produce things that haven't been produced before. This is anybody want to get into a really hot field in biology, get into synthetic biology. And that, I have no idea what it's going to be, but it is going to be big. So if we've had those syntheses, are there synthetic mind-body states? That is, are there mind-body states that have not been produced before? And I think this is the big opening, which is both scary and has great possibilities. Now, if all of our abilities reside in mind-body states, for example, most of us are in our default mind-body state now, and our thinking and so forth takes place in that state. We saw examples of switching mind-body states and solving problems, switching mind-body states and having meaningful spiritual experiences. So what happens if we invent mind-body states that have not been invented before? Because most psychotechnologies are used alone. Sometimes you see two of them. But I think what we need is a systematic approach to inventing new mind-body states by putting these ingredients together in new recipes or new sequences. So just as it's possible to write a number of programs for computers and apps for all devices, is it possible to develop mind apps? That is, new ways of using our mind by using these ingredients in new recipes to produce new mind-body states. And will we discover new abilities that reside in those states that don't reside in our ordinary state? So the things that we think are rare and unusual might be rare and unusual because they reside in other mind-body states. Parapsychological abilities are an example of that. So, and there are all these stories about, 95-pound woman takes cement truck off baby. Okay, clearly she was in a different state to do that. So are there human abilities that are not discovered or that can be developed more in other mind-body states? So here we are, we're back to where we started. Apps are to devices, as psychotechnologies are to minds. Any questions? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about Groff and what he said?
Talk more about Groff and what he said, yes. In my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people, Groff is the psychotherapist who has the widest and deepest experience with using LSD psychotherapy. Well, let me say, in the book Higher Wisdom, two psychiatrists claim that he is probably the person who has the widest view of human experience. So if you want to get into psychotherapy, Groff's book, originally called Realms of the Human Unconscious, but now republished as LSD Doorway to the Numinous, is the one to go to look at historically, and then catch up on the new stuff. Boy, I don't know where to, this is such a long story. Well, originally he came from Czechoslovakia, was trained in psychiatry at Charles University, escaped in Prague Springs, and came to the United States and ran a group at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center that did the early research in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s using psychedelics as treatment for neuroses and psychoses. So as a psychiatrist, I mean, that was the population he was interested in. And he's written a lot about this. He came up with a 4-level view of the human mind. The first two fit in with what we know from Freudian psychology. The first is called abstract and aesthetic, and that's just the things going on in our minds and the things we see. The next is personal history, and that would be from birth until now. Basically, most psychotherapies look for the origin of problems that aren't biological as something that's happened between birth and now, interaction with other people or so forth. And much against his training and in spite of his resistance, his clients convinced him that they could remember during psychedelic experiences their own birth processes and elements from their birth process. And when they did that and they integrated them, this is a psychiatric treatment, so the person just doesn't have the problem but talks over and talks it through and catharsis all the stuff and integrates it, that the symptoms would go away. And then below this, transpersonal level, which seems to pick up material that does not come from the person's own biological life. Okay, transpersonal psychology is the field that develops this. So that's basically what he found, and it's a very rich source of ideas. So anyway, that's sort of a quickie on Stan Groff, but very worthwhile. He is a good example of someone in a profession, in this case psychiatry, who also has an extremely broad and deep knowledge in humanities and the social sciences. So there's all kinds of, it's a very rich intellectual reading. Yes?
This is a combined question for you, Dr. Roberts, and for Dr. Cousy. If a near-death experience is considered a mystical experience, and it's possible for a DMT to naturally occur in the brain. Could that be a causative factor in the alteration of that mind-body state in the near-death experience?
Well, some people are claiming things like that. I should say that when I use the word mystical, I mean it in a very specific psychology of religion sense. I don't mean it in the sense of Halloweeny and spooky and, I mean, imagine a movie like Three-Headed Zombies from Outer Space invade Area 51, okay, that not me. But in the psychology of religion, it has a very particular meanings, and Nick mentioned a lot of those, like transcending the self, states of unity.
Would you call a near-death experience that? I mean, that would fit under that.
For some people it is, and some people it isn't.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, now, there's that question of why for some and why not for others. But Nick, do you want to?
Well, just with respect to DMT, that maybe certain physical conditions produce or cause the body to produce, like a near-death, like maybe, there's a release of DMT. I mean, it's just a speculation, but people, when they talk about near-death experiences, sometimes there's significant overlap with psychedelic experiences, especially like access to other persons. They might see their family members who have been deceased or have other extraordinary, floating or time dilation, things like that. I'm not saying that they're identical to psychedelic experiences, but there's some shared elements, and it's just been speculated that DMT may play a role there.
Well, I had no idea that DMT naturally occurred in the brain, so I was fascinated by what you said today, and having had a near-death experience, which fit into your definition of a mystical experience, was putting the two thoughts together saying, wow, with head trauma, is it possible that we elicit that DMT, and then if you have a near-death experience, it's like your own psychedelic internal experience without having to ingest anything.
Right, and also, when it's ingested, you're kind of producing a situation that, when we're talking about near-death experience or dreams or a spontaneous spiritual experience, I mean, I'm thinking of Jacob's Ladder as being kind of a psychedelic experience, angels coming and going and stuff. But, it may be, different if you take it and ingest it. You may be turning on other circuits or whatever. I mean, I don't want to be too reductionist about it, but that's about all I can say about it.
Thank you.
Let me ask a question too. Is why would we have evolved to have mystical experiences? Okay. I'm sorry, there's a question right here. Somebody about, yes.
A group of medical students were performing some sort of research in one of the departments in the University of London some years ago. What I'm trying to say here is concerning the mind, the mystical experiences, even during or death or near death, that in the course of trying to operate, they went and exhumed one of the persons that died, and they were trying to perform some experimental surgery. And so as they were operating on him, they went and touched one of the nerves, and the person shook and of course scared the medical students, and sat up and started recounting his experience, how they were moving with him from place to place, and he was finding it difficult for the spirit to come back into the body. And now I want to find out thinking and idea thinking in a philosophical way to try to reconnect these two together to come out with psychotechnologies. Would that fit in the explanation you were giving?
I think it would be, but that is something you'll have to chase down. You're more. It sounds like you're more competent at that than I am, so I can't say that. Other than, it sounds like really worthwhile chasing down, and that's as much as I can sort of say about that. So, There was another question, yes.
Yeah, I like that you tied in the analogy that psychedelic experiences and other experiences like dreams, sensory deprivation, meditation, those type of things. And I was wondering what it is you think, what is it about these altered states of consciousness that is therapeutic? So we know that these things, any of them, can be beneficial for depression or a range of other things. So I'm just curious your thoughts on how that is or why that happens.
The question is when we consider not only psychedelics but other mind-body states, they often turn out to be psychotherapeutic, and why? Is that a fair way to rephrase it? Well, my guess at this is that, for one thing, well, there are probably several mechanisms going. One is in psychedelic psychotherapy, we'll get into Groff in this one, he comes up with two types of therapy. In one, the person has a low to moderate dose and goes back and re-experiences a traumatic experience in his or her life, and then it works it through with the psychotherapist. Okay, so this is like regular psychotherapy, and the use of psychedelics here is to bring material up from the unconscious to make it conscious, and that's that, bring material up from dreams to make them conscious. Okay, so there's that. So there's a regular sort of psychotherapeutic process that may go on. Now, the one I find most interesting myself is if we ask the question, how does I, the sense of I, individuality, vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? And it clearly does in mystical states, and clearly does in dreams. It may be that sort of taking a step outside yourself allows you to look at those events and find them non-threatening. Okay, that process may be going on. Now, in a mystical experience, one of the major events, sort of the characteristic that is almost always talked about, is a shift in the sense of I, or forgetting the I-ness. It's as if I had a jacket on named Tom Roberts, and I put it to the side, and there's Tom Roberts over there, and here's something left. And this is one of the things that happens in mystical experiences. That allows one to have one's problems over there and to disidentify with them. So my guess, there are probably a lot of mechanisms going on. My guess is that's one of the mechanisms. Okay, and also when in the death studies, I think this is like practice dying, where the people have a mystical experience, they sort of give up their egos temporarily. And a lot of the fear of death is the fear of giving up one's ego, oneself. Okay. Now, if you had a practice doing that, which is what they're doing now at Bellevue and Hopkins, people come back and it doesn't treat the underlying disease, but it treats the fear of dying. Okay, that's the purpose of that therapy. And I think the movement there is to disidentify with yourself and to realize that after you sort of take off that ego and put it over there, there's still going to be something left. Okay, and that makes the dying experience less frightening. That's having given up the ego once and having basically a positive experience, it's not frightening to do it again. But I expect there are other mechanisms going on there too. So, yeah, Ruth Ann?
I thought it was very interesting. Now, this was about 25 years ago, but I was reading about, I think it first started with Omni magazine. I read an article there, and it was about ibogaine or ibogaine, depending on how you say it. And I started a correspondence with someone, and what he was finding, however, he did this, was that ibogaine could eliminate an addiction that a person had just in a one-time shot at a certain dosage. And it didn't matter so much if the person went back to his old habitat and his old friends, and which usually bring about downfall again. But then, so this was like extraordinary, and of course I haven't heard too much about it since.
I'll be talking about it.
Oh, will you? Okay. Well, I'll just finish this up. That he went to Mexico since it wasn't legal in the United States and so on, and he went to some clinic and talked to the head person there, who asked, like, well, what's the success rate? And it was, you know, it was extraordinary success rate. And the man said immediately, nope. Well, why? You know, we want a higher success rate. What is this? And he said, no, he said, there are too many, he said that would put our families in danger, us in danger. There are too many forces that don't want these things cured. They don't want these addictions eliminated. You know, and I thought that was very interesting because there are so many, whether it's the police, the professionals, you know, there's such a group of enterprises around addiction that to have some substance that could eliminate it like that, we don't want that.
That's a common argument. I don't accept it. I think that you always have to ask, you know, here we are in a court of law, who benefits? So who benefits from the war on drugs? Well, police definitely do. Treatment specialists definitely do. And we can go on and list a whole bunch of things. But I think in every one of those cases, there's enough to keep them busy without chasing down drugs. Okay, and that is not a real, I was going to say paranoid. I would put it that's over calling it, I think. But I just don't see that. I don't think that's happening. By the way, there is additional work on ibogaine. Were you going to talk about?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. So that'll be a good. Yes.
Well, I'm an advocate for the perception enhancements and its degree of focus it can grant to somebody. I have a question in regards to, has there been any study about the casted personality types, like the Hindu system, the caste system? The casted personality types, when you give these psychedelics or psychotherapy to these people, some people can handle the loosening of the seams of their reality, and some people will become unraveled. And we haven't seen that much here, but I mean, I know that's an extreme possibility. I'm sure it's happened plenty of times that we're talking about here. When we get into that, I mean, is there a guided format to that and controlling that mind? You said, you know, putting a blindfold on somebody earlier and letting them lay down in a bed. I mean, that can freak somebody out the rest of their life, and next thing you know, they got 10 bottles of Xanax sitting next to their bed, right?
Well, if people, and part of the preparation is to let people know this is what's going to happen. They can even go into the session room and see if they want to do it. And if they're uncomfortable with it, they don't qualify even. Okay, so the people are selected for people who are willing to do this. You asked originally sort of about the caste system. Let's take SES, socioeconomic status, as a variable in this. At Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, they had them all the way from criminals through rather wealthy people. The variables are probably not so much SES as they are personality variables. And the personality, actually, if you think of, I like to think of psychedelics as being psychomagnifiers. Groff uses the word amplifier. I'm visual, so I use magnifier. And they magnify whatever is sort of going on in your mind already. And that includes positive traits and negative traits. So if you're someone who was made afraid by this experience, not only would the experience, not only would it not help you, it would make it worse. This is one of the understanding for bad trips.
Well, one of the things that it was good for, though, is the loosening. And as it gets retightened, it teaches you how to control it and bring it back together.
For a lot of people, most of the time, but not for everybody all the time. By the way, everything that we're saying is a matter of, under the right conditions for some people some of the time, not for all the people all the time. Psychedelics are always that way. There's never anything that, you know, you're guaranteed to have this experience because, as Nick said, the experiences are your own mindset, your own psychological makeup, and the situation that you're in. Well, that's it, I guess, Bruce?
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts.